I hadn't planned to stop at my mother's that afternoon, but the sky had that pewter look that makes you crave a familiar kitchen and something warm on the stove. Noah was in the passenger seat begging to show Grandma his science fair model. I turned down Sycamore Drive and saw it before I felt it, Aaron's graphite pickup at the curb hood, still ticking cab empty. My heart stuttered, and the small, ordinary noises of the neighborhood leaf blowers, a dog's bark. A far-off train dropped into a hushed tunnel. I took Noah's hand, led him along the side path, and eased us beneath the kitchen window I knew from childhood could carry every word. The clink of glass, my mother's quick laugh, then Aaron's voice, low and guarded, talking about me as though I were an obligation he'd outgrown. The words didn't make sense at first. They were just sounds that felt like cold water down my back. When meaning finally caught up, I felt Noah's fingers tighten around mine, and I knew the shape of my life had shifted quiet as a door closing in the next room. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comment city-state or country, and if stories about family trust and hard-earned justice speak to you, tap like and subscribe so more people can find these. My name is Meredith, and for most of my 30s, I told myself I was lucky a good kid from a cramped Cape Cod on the east side of town who married a man everyone liked and made a home 2 blocks from maple trees that turned the street into gold each October. I shelved books at the community college where the hum of copy machines and the soft shuffle of pages felt like sanctuary, and I timed our dinners around Aaron's job sites because construction work moves with weather and luck. My mother, Judith, taught me to sit up straight, say, "Thank you," and never be too much, too opinionated, too needy, too anything. So I learned to be easy. Easy to get along with, easy to forgive, easy to overlook. Aaron and I met at a fundraiser for the high school band. He cracked a joke about raffle baskets. I laughed too loud, and we fell into the version of love that moves quickly because it's sweet to be chosen. He had strong hands and a way of making neighbors feel seen, and I prized that like a rare coin. We bought a small 2-bedroom and turned it into 3 when Noah came along a wall framed on a Saturday electrical lines, strung over a Sunday lunch paint chosen after Noah's nap. It wasn't glamorous, but in pictures it looks warm. Tupperware leftovers on the table, secondhand couch, laundry folded in neat towers, because neatness felt like proof of a life held together. Money was never flashy. It was a budget scribbled in pencil and a jar for Noah's college fund that we stopped opening because it made my stomach flutter. When my father died and left a modest life insurance policy, it felt like a safety rope tied loosely around our waist. Nothing to flaunt, only something to steady us if a job fell through, or the roof needed work. Aaron said he'd handle the paperwork because he was good with forms, and I said thank you because that's what I was taught to say. The deposit went where he said it should, the statements came by email, and I skimmed them the way you glance at the weather when you've already packed an umbrella. On the surface, our routines made sense early: alarms, the smell of coffee. Noah's lunch bag labeled in Sharpie. My mother's calls arriving just when I was chopping onions or folding towels, so my hands were busy and my answers were short. Judith liked updates about Aaron's business and contractors by name, and I told myself she simply cared about the details because details meant control, and control meant safety. If she sounded more interested in him than in me, I smoothed it over with a thin coat of gratitude. If Aaron came home late with clean boots and a second shower already taken somewhere else, I told myself job sites had changing rooms, and what did I know about construction anyway? Some nights after Noah fell asleep, I'd sit at the edge of our bed and listen to the house breathe, furnace kicking on the fridge, clicking a car rolling past. I'd tell myself that a good marriage includes seasons, and a good daughter forgives tone, and a good mother keeps the peace so her child floats instead of sinks. I repeated those ideas until they sounded like prayer. When you live that way long enough, you mistake quiet for peace, and you forget that silence also belongs to secrets. The day the sky turned pewter and pulled me toward my mother's kitchen, nothing felt cinematic. No thunder cracked, no glass shattered, just a driveway with a familiar truck and the whisper of leaves underfoot as Noah and I slid beneath a window I used to press my ear to when my parents argued in low, careful voices. The scent of my mother's lavender cleaner came through the screen, and the scrape of a chair leg told me where she sat. And then Aaron, comfortable and unguarded, spoke about me the way men talk about a tool that's gone dull, useful once, now in the way. Words like tired and too much, the kind you don't notice until you stack them together and see the shape they make. I didn't knock. I didn't cry. I stood up with my son's small hand in mine and walked us back to the car, because some truths don't belong to a scene, they belong to a decision. The engine turned over the radio, found a soft station, and I stared at the steering wheel until the world came back into focus. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror, and in that narrow space between the curb and the first stop sign, I understood that keeping the peace had cost me the only kind of safety that matters. I parked 2 blocks over and watched the light change on the windshield, Noah humming to himself, the model rocket rolling on the floor mat. My phone buzzed with a text from Aaron about dinner, cheerful, ordinary, perfectly timed. I typed back something equally ordinary because I needed the night to look exactly the same from the outside. Somewhere inside that hush, a steadier voice rose up, one I hadn't heard since I was a girl who hid library books under her pillow and promised herself a different kind of life. I didn't know yet what I would do, only that I would stop being easy. I put the car in drive and told Noah we'd head home, that Grandma was busy, and we'd show her the rocket another day. He nodded and asked if we could have pancakes for dinner, the kind with blueberries, and I said yes, because saying yes to him felt like a small anchor in fast water. We rounded the corner, sycamore slipping behind us, my mother's kitchen window shrinking to a square of light, and I kept my eyes on the road and my voice even. By the time we reached our street, I knew the next time I parked in front of that window, I wouldn't be the one listening. The drive home after leaving my mother's house felt endless, even though the town was only 20 minutes across. Noah sat in the back seat humming to himself, and I forced my breathing to stay steady, keeping my voice light when he asked about dinner. But inside, the words I had heard still echoed, scraping like sharp stones against the walls of my chest. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead I folded myself into silence, because silence was the only shield I had left in that moment. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I had fixed a smile on my face so Noah would not see how close I was to unraveling. That night, Aaron came home later than usual, boots polished, and shirt too clean for someone who claimed to be at a renovation site all day. He dropped his keys on the counter and kissed my cheek, asking if Noah had finished his homework, as though nothing were wrong. His voice carried the same warmth it always did, but I could hear the falseness hiding behind it now. Every casual word felt like a cover he had rehearsed, a mask meant to keep me blind. I nodded, pretending along with him, even as my hands shook when I washed the dishes. Over the following week, the unease only grew. Aaron had started taking his phone with him everywhere, even to the shower, which he had never done before. He changed his passcode, and when I asked about it, he brushed me off with a laugh, saying it was for work security. But he tilted the screen away whenever I walked into the room, and his tone had an edge that made my stomach twist. At the same time, my mother began asking strangely specific questions during our phone calls about Aaron's jobs, about clients' names, about things I hadn't told her. Each question sounded casual, but underneath, I could hear something more like she already knew the answers and wanted to test if I was aware of them too. At work, I tried to bury myself in the quiet of the library. Evelyn noticed my distraction, but never pressed, offering only gentle encouragement and small kindnesses, like slipping a wrapped cookie into my bag when she thought I wasn't looking. Still whispers found me where I least expected. One afternoon, while reshelving in the children's section, I overheard 2 staff members at the front desk speaking in low tones. They mentioned seeing Aaron and my mother together at the diner, laughing over lunch, leaning in close. Their voices dropped when they realized I was nearby, but it was too late. The words struck hard, pulling me back to that window and the sound of their laughter at my expense. That evening, Aaron came home smelling faintly of cologne he never wore around me. He said the job site was running late, though his boots were spotless and his hands soft, with no trace of drywall dust. I asked how the project was going, and he gave me vague answers, eyes sliding away as he loosened his tie. I wanted to confront him, to lay out every detail I had pieced together. But the image of Noah at the kitchen table stopped me. My son's head bent over his math workbook was the reminder that I could not explode, not yet. If Aaron and my mother believed I was weak, then my weakness could become my greatest disguise. 2 weeks later, Noah had a half day at school. He asked if we could stop by Grandma Judith's to show her his rocket, his voice full of excitement. I hesitated dialing her number first, but her house phone rang unanswered and her cell went straight to voicemail. Noah suggested we drive by anyway, and though dread pressed heavy on my chest, I agreed. As we turned onto her street, the sight of Aaron's truck in her driveway made my hands tremble against the steering wheel. Noah looked up from his game wide-eyed. "Isn't that Dad's truck?" he asked. I swallowed hard and told him we'd wait a moment, pretending to think. Deep inside, every instinct screamed to turn around, but another part of me needed confirmation. I parked across the street and told Noah we'd walk around back, that I wanted to surprise his grandmother. The crisp air bit at my cheeks as we slipped quietly along the path to the kitchen window. It was the same place I had stood countless times as a child, overhearing arguments I wasn't supposed to hear. Now, with my son's hand gripping mine, I pressed close to the glass and heard voices as clear as if I were in the room. Aaron's tone was weary, dismissive. "She's too broken, Judith. Always crying, always needing something. I can't keep doing this." My mother's laugh followed, sharp and satisfied. "I told you not to marry her. She was never strong enough for you, never good enough, too damaged." The words slammed into me, each one a blade cutting away the illusion I had clung to. I felt Noah tense beside me, his small fingers pressing deeper into my palm. Then came the truth that stole the air from my lungs. Aaron spoke of the insurance money my father had left, saying it had been worth tolerating me until most of it was gone. He told my mother he planned to leave to take everything, certain I would never fight back. And she, my own mother, encouraged him, laughing at my supposed weakness, saying I would accept it all in silence. Together, they reduced me to a caricature of neediness and failure. Two conspirators, united by contempt and greed. The world tilted, but I forced myself to stay upright, gripping the window frame until my knuckles ached. My father, gentle and kind, had left that money to protect me and Noah, to secure our future. And here they were planning to strip it from us, mocking the grief that had already broken me once. I felt something sharp and unfamiliar flare in my chest, then not sorrow, but the first spark of something colder. When their laughter faded into casual talk about timing, I pulled Noah back and whispered for him to stay quiet. My legs shook as we made our way to the car, but my voice was steady when I told him we were heading home. He asked why Dad's truck was there, why we didn't knock, and I told him Aaron was helping Grandma with something that we'd see him later. He accepted it, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. The drive back was a blur of shifting colors and silence. Inside, I felt as though something had died, but in its place, another part of me stirred awake. They believed I would crumble, that I would cry and beg and do nothing. They thought my silence was weakness. They did not yet know that silence could also be the cover for something else entirely. That night, I stood before the bathroom mirror and truly looked at myself. The woman staring back was tired. her hair pulled into the same plain style she had worn for years, her clothes chosen for modesty rather than joy. But behind her eyes, I saw a flicker of resolve. I understood then that my life as I had known it was over, and the person they had underestimated would never return. When Aaron finally came home near midnight, he kissed me lightly and spoke of long hours of dust and deadlines. I smiled as though nothing had changed, setting a plate on the table for him, nodding at his stories. But inside, I was already moving, already planning. Their laughter had ended something in me, but it had also begun something else. A quiet, deliberate strength that would not rest until they knew what it meant to underestimate me. And as I lay awake, listening to Aaron's steady breathing beside me, I understood that the time for easy acceptance had ended. The life I had thought was unshakable was gone, and in its place stood the beginning of something far more dangerous. The days after overhearing Aaron and my mother together passed in a haze. I moved through each morning, as though on autopilot, packing Noah's lunch, brewing coffee, greeting Aaron at the door with the same small smile I had worn for years. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, I felt hollowed out, as if something vital had been scooped clean from me. The weight of what I had heard pressed down on every thought, yet I couldn't let Noah see the cracks in my voice or the tremor in my hands. He needed steadiness, so I gave him steadiness, even if it meant swallowing the storm whole. At work, the library felt different too. The sound of pages turning, the soft chatter of students, even Evelyn's warm greetings, all of it felt like I was listening from the other side of a glass wall. I smiled and nodded at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every word Aaron and Judith had spoken. When Evelyn noticed I was quieter than usual, she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and asked if I was getting enough rest. I told her I was fine, the way I had always told people I was fine, though inside my chest tightened with the lie. Nights were the hardest. Lying beside Aaron, I listened to his even breathing, the faint rasp in his throat, when he was deeply asleep. I wanted to shove him awake to scream until he admitted everything, but instead, I lay still, staring at the ceiling. My body remained rigid beside his, while my mind spun circles around the memories of that afternoon. My mother's laugh, his careless tone, their casual cruelty. More than once, I found myself slipping out of bed to stand in the bathroom mirror, again, searching my reflection for the woman they described. Weak, pathetic, too much trouble to love. The face staring back didn't look like those words yet. They lingered, clinging like smoke to my skin. Noah noticed more than I wished he would. One evening, while I was folding laundry in the living room, he looked up from his science book and asked if I was mad at Dad. The innocence in his voice cut deeper than any accusation. I smoothed the towel in my hands and forced a smile, telling him everything was fine, that grown-ups just got tired sometimes. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, as if he already knew I was hiding something. That moment alone was enough to remind me how careful I needed to be. The next Saturday, my mother called out of the blue. Her voice carried that familiar mixture of syrup and steel as she asked about Aaron, about how hard he was working, about how I was managing on my own while he took on such long hours. I murmured answers short and polite, and all the while, her questions struck like tiny blades. She never once asked about me for the sake of me, only in the shadow of him. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time, feeling both exposed and invisible. Aaron's absences grew more frequent. He returned home late with excuses about projects that never seemed to show up on his schedule. His phone lit up at odd hours, and when I reached for it once, he yanked it away with a smile too sharp to be convincing. I stopped asking questions, not because I believed his lies, but because the answers no longer mattered. The truth was already etched into me from that day at the window. Every night, I played my part cooking meals, folding laundry, keeping Noah's life steady. Every night, I buried my pain beneath the mask of the woman they believed I was. Some evenings after Noah went to bed, I drove quietly through town, circling streets near my mother's house or the diner where people said they had been seen together. I never confronted them. I only watched my fingers tight around the steering wheel, trying to piece together a life that had always been lived behind my back. Those drives gave me no peace, but they gave me focus, something to pour the gnawing ache into. What surprised me most was how ordinary their betrayal looked from the outside. Aaron still kissed my cheek each morning. Judith still called to offer her sharp little observations. On the surface, everything appeared intact, but now I could hear the false notes in every word, see the way their glances lingered when they thought no one was paying attention. The disguise was so thin, I wondered how I had ever failed to notice it before. One evening, Noah was in bed when Aaron returned home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. He set down his jacket and began telling me about another long day, but the details unraveled too quickly. The words fell apart as soon as they left his mouth, and I only nodded, setting a plate on the table as though nothing were amiss. Inside, though, I felt that steady flame growing. It was not rage that kept me awake anymore. It was something quieter, sharper, the realization that their betrayal had already carved away the softer parts of me. What remained was waiting patient and unflinching. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling as Aaron drifted into sleep beside me, and I understood something I hadn't before. Grief had hollowed me out, but in the hollow, there was space for something new to grow. Pain had silenced me, but the silence gave me room to listen, to watch, to collect. I could no longer stop what had already been set in motion, but I could decide what came next. By morning, I was back at the stove pouring Noah's pancakes and listening to Aaron talk about a client's renovation. My smile was steady, my voice calm. Nothing in my manner gave away that the woman they believed too weak to fight was no longer standing there. The mask fit perfectly, but behind it, something unshakable had begun to take shape. And as I carried plates to the table and listened to Aaron laugh, I knew the time would come when he and Judith would learn exactly what silence had been hiding. The morning I finally stopped pretending to myself began quietly. Sunlight slid through the blinds in thin stripes across the quilt, and I lay still, listening to Aaron's steady breathing beside me. For weeks, I had moved through each day as though I were acting in a play, wearing the mask of the grateful wife, smiling through dinners, nodding at his excuses. But that morning, staring at the ceiling, I felt something shift. The ache that had lived inside me since that day at my mother's window was still there, but alongside it was a sharper clarity, a sense that I could no longer sit idle while they dismantled my life. I rose before Aaron stirred, stepping softly across the hall to the bathroom. The mirror reflected a face I hardly recognized. My hair was pulled back in the same tired style. Faint shadows darkened my eyes, and my mouth looked pinched from nights spent holding back words. But behind the weariness, there was something else now, something steadier. For the first time in weeks, I didn't see only the woman they mocked. I saw someone who could endure, someone who could fight. Later that morning, while Noah was busy packing his school bag, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold and pulled out the stack of bank statements Aaron kept filed in a drawer. He had always insisted on managing our finances, saying it was easier that way, and I had agreed without protest. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw withdrawals I didn't recognize, accounts I hadn't known existed. The numbers blurred, then sharpened into something undeniable. The money my father had left for Noah's future money, I believed was resting safely, had been draining away piece by piece. Some of it had gone to purchases that didn't exist in our home, others to accounts with his name alone. I pressed my palms to the cool surface of the table and let the betrayal settle into something hard. That afternoon, I stopped at the bank on my way home from work. The branch manager, Mr. Grant, had known me for years. His polite smile faded when I asked to review the transfers linked to my name. Mrs. Cole. I'll need a few minutes to gather the records, he said gently. While I waited, the walls seemed to hum around me, every tick of the clock reminding me how long I had been blind. When he returned, he laid out the papers one by one, pointing to signatures he assumed were mine. The loops and slants looked familiar, but not my own. My throat tightened as I realized Aaron had been signing for me, moving my inheritance into places I had no access to. Driving home afterward, I felt strangely calm. Anger had burned through me in the weeks before, but now it was replaced by a cool steadiness. I finally saw the shape of their plan, first strip the accounts, then leave me with nothing but memories. They had counted on me to collapse quietly. Instead, I felt the first threads of a plan forming. That evening, Aaron walked in later than usual. His shirt was crisp, his shoes spotless, and he smelled faintly of aftershave. Long day, he said, with a practiced sigh, dropping his phone onto the counter face down. I turned from the stove, wiping my hands on a towel, and asked how the project was going. He rattled off a few details, all vague, all rehearsed. I smiled softly, serving dinner, as though nothing had changed, but inside, I was memorizing every slip, every deflection. I let him believe I was still the same woman who never asked questions. When Noah was asleep, I returned to the mirror once more. I stood there longer this time, studying the slope of my shoulders, the curve of my mouth, the steady gaze I hadn't seen in years. My mother's voice echoed faintly in memory, her constant criticisms layered over each other, like a chorus, too plain, too fragile, too needy. For so long, I had believed her shaping myself smaller, so that others could fill the space. But seeing Aaron's lies laid bare, hearing their contempt through that window, had shown me the truth. Their words said more about who they were than who I was. The following weekend, Judith called again. Her tone was sugar-sweet, asking if Aaron was keeping up with his long hours, if I was managing while he worked so hard. I responded politely, keeping my voice even though each word landed like a stone. She asked about Noah only after a pause, almost as an afterthought. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen with the phone still in my hand and felt the old ache twist once more. But this time, instead of sinking into it, I let it harden. Her voice no longer carried the same power over me. Over the next days, I moved with intention. I began to gather small details without letting on. Receipts tucked into Aaron's jacket pocket notes, scribbled on loose papers in his truck, the sudden way his phone lit up when he thought I wasn't looking. Each piece became part of a picture I kept carefully hidden. I didn't know yet exactly what I would do, but I knew I would not remain their victim. One night, as Aaron drifted to sleep, I lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. The house was still the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. In that stillness, I made myself a promise. I would no longer cling to the illusion of safety built on their lies. I would no longer beg for scraps of love or approval. I would become the woman they least expected, the one who refused to break. By the time dawn spread pale light across the walls, I felt something inside me settle. The grief and confusion that had weighed me down were still there, but now they were balanced by something sharper, something steady. The decision was made. I would watch. I would wait, and when the time was right, I would act. The day began like any other, with coffee and Noah's chatter about school projects, but beneath it all, a new thread ran through me. I had awakened to the truth of who I was, and nothing could push me back into the shadows again. And as Aaron left with his polished boots and empty excuses, I closed the door behind him and knew the next steps would no longer be about survival alone. They would be about reclaiming the dignity they had tried so hard to take from me. The week after my quiet awakening, I began the smallest of steps. Outwardly, I lived as though nothing had changed, packing Noah's lunch, setting dinner on the table, listening to Aaron talk about late nights on jobs that didn't exist. Inwardly, I was building a careful rhythm, one that allowed me to gather what I needed while never tipping my hand. Silence became my ally, and each smile I offered was a mask I wore willingly. One of my first errands was to the bank. I had called ahead and asked to meet with someone in fraud services, a conversation I cloaked in polite words about needing reassurance. That afternoon, I sat across from Carol Simmons, a woman with a calm, steady demeanor, and eyes that suggested she had seen far worse than forged signatures. She listened without judgment as I laid out my concerns, nodding gently when I showed her the transfers that had my name written in a hand too smooth to be mine. "We'll start documenting quietly," she assured me. "Nothing will move without your awareness from now on." I thanked her, keeping my voice even though inside my chest pulsed with relief. At the library, Evelyn noticed the sharper focus in my movements, though she never pressed. When she asked how things were at home, I told her Aaron was working late again, and she gave me a look that said she understood more than I had spoken. Her quiet support was like a soft quilt laid over sharp edges. It steadied me in ways she couldn't have known. Aaron, on the other hand, grew restless. One night, over dinner, he asked about the remainder of my father's insurance payout, his voice feigning casual interest. I lifted my fork slowly, keeping my gaze steady as I told him the funds were secure. His hand tightened briefly around his glass before he smiled and shifted the conversation. I made note of the slip, the way greed leaked through the cracks in his performance. It wasn't only Aaron I studied. My mother's calls became more frequent, each one circling back to Aaron in some way. She asked about his projects, his health, his stress, always before asking about me or Noah. I let her speak, answered softly, and tucked away every detail. When she offered to stop by one evening, I insisted on hosting dinner the following weekend instead. The suggestion seemed to please her, though her tone carried the smug sweetness of a woman who believed she was in control. Preparing for that dinner became another deliberate step. While Aaron was out, I installed a small recorder in the living room shelf, its light hidden beneath a decorative frame. The idea of capturing their words in my own home both sickened and steadied me. If they chose to speak freely, I would have proof of more than suspicion. The act of tucking that device into place felt like drawing a first line on paper, faint but unshakable. The night of the dinner, I served roast and potatoes as though nothing in our world had shifted. Judith arrived in a tailored dress, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. She hugged me with arms that felt brittle and cold, then turned her smile toward Aaron with a warmth that twisted my stomach. Through the evening, I caught the small glances they thought I missed, the familiarity in their conversation that no daughter should ever overhear between her mother and her husband. Each glance was another stitch in the tapestry of betrayal, another knot in the cord I was braiding slowly into a rope. After she left, Aaron helped clear the table, his manner practiced and easy. "Your mother enjoyed herself," he said, his tone casual. I nodded, gathering plates, murmuring something about how family dinners were good for us. He smiled, satisfied with my compliance. But in the quiet of the night, I replayed the recorder and listened to the soft undertone of their voices when I had stepped out for dessert. The words weren't sharp enough to carry conviction in court, but they held familiarity enough to prove what my heart already knew. In the days that followed, I began documenting in earnest. I created a private folder on the library computer, one that Aaron could never access, and stored copies of receipts, bank statements, and recordings. Carol at the bank forwarded me the official confirmations of forged transactions, each stamped with dates and details that formed a timeline of his theft. I printed them quietly and tucked them into a binder I kept locked in a drawer at work. Each page added weight, not just to the binder, but to my resolve. At home, I remained gentle, almost tender. I asked Aaron about his projects, listened with interest, and laughed softly when he teased Noah at the dinner table. He seemed almost proud of himself for keeping our life steady, unaware that the calm he saw in me was no longer surrender, but preparation. One night, Noah asked if we could build his rocket together that weekend. I agreed quickly, eager for something that was ours alone, something untouched by the lies swirling around us. As we glued the fins in place and painted the body a bright shade of blue, he talked about school and friends and asked if Dad would come to watch the launch. My throat tightened, but I told him yes, not ready to show him the fractures behind the curtain. In those hours, the scent of glue and paint felt like a balm, a reminder of what I was fighting to protect. The mask grew easier with time. I no longer flinched when Aaron kissed my cheek, or when my mother praised him with backhanded compliments about me. Instead, I stored the words carefully, like evidence to be brought forward when the time was right. It became almost mechanical, this act of pretending, but beneath it pulsed a rhythm of determination. Late one night, I caught Aaron on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was low, but I heard enough to understand. He was speaking to my mother, telling her I was still clueless, that the accounts would soon be emptied completely. I stood at the top of the stairs, holding my breath, the recorder in my hand, capturing every word. When I returned to bed, I lay beside him silent and calm, while inside me the plan sharpened into something undeniable. By then, I knew my path. I would not confront them in a blaze of anger. I would not collapse in tears as they expected. Instead, I would continue building quietly, piece by piece, until the foundation of their lies crumbled beneath them. And as I closed my eyes that night, listening to Aaron's steady breathing, I understood that the first defiance was already underway. What came next would no longer be about gathering scraps of truth. It would be about setting the stage for their undoing. The night I heard Aaron whispering to my mother over the phone, I knew my time for silence was almost over. He had spoken as if I were invisible, telling her that I was too naive to suspect a thing, boasting that soon the accounts would be drained. I stood at the top of the stairs with the recorder humming in my hand, catching every word. It was the final stone in the wall I had been building for weeks. From that moment forward, I understood I had enough to pull the ground from under both of them. The next morning, I dropped Noah off at school with an extra hug and drove straight to an office in the next town over. The name on the door read, Dana Walsh, Attorney at Law. She had been recommended quietly by a contact at the library who knew how to keep confidence. Dana greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that didn't waver when I told her what I had uncovered. I laid out the forged signatures, the withdrawals, the recordings of Aaron and Judith, and the photographs of their meetings. She flipped through the binder in silence, the corner of her mouth tightening with each page. When she finally looked up, she said in a measured voice, "You've built an airtight case, Mrs. Cole. We can freeze the accounts, secure the house, and file for divorce all at once. The question is, how far you want to go." Her words sat between us like a challenge. I thought of Aaron's smug tone, my mother's laughter, the years of belittlement and lies. I pictured Noah's face, his trust in me to keep him safe. "All the way," I said quietly. "Every step of the way." Dana nodded, sliding a stack of forms toward me. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but when I signed, I felt a steadiness ripple through me stronger than anything I had known in months. That afternoon, I met again with Carol at the bank. Together with Dana, they coordinated the timing of the freezes and flagged every account Aaron had tried to use in my name. Carol showed me the documents proving the forgeries, each one another nail in the coffin of his schemes. "The moment we file, he won't have access to a dime," she said. Her tone was professional, but her eyes carried a flicker of something else, approval perhaps, or the quiet respect of someone who had seen women rise from worse. At home that evening, I slipped back into the role Aaron expected. I made his favorite stew, asked about his day, and listened to his practice stories about delays at job sites. He smiled when I laughed at his jokes, smug in his belief that I was still blind. But as I cleared the dishes, I thought of the documents waiting on Dana's desk, of the court orders already in motion. My mask didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like armor. 2 nights later, I followed him. He had said he'd be late again, muttering about permits and subcontractors. Instead, I parked far enough from the old motel near the edge of town and watched as his truck pulled up beside my mother's sedan. Through the narrow curtain gap of room 214, I saw the shape of their bodies move with a familiarity that sickened me. My camera captured each detail. The cars side by side, the timestamp glowing, their shadows pressed too close together. When they finally stepped out, Judith adjusting her blouse, Aaron holding her elbow, I snapped the photographs with steady hands. The next morning, I handed the pictures to Dana along with the newest recording. She spread everything across her desk like pieces of a puzzle, each one fitting neatly into place. "By the time we serve him, he won't know which way is up," she said. Her confidence steadied me. For the first time since this began, I believed not just that I could survive, but that I could win. Friday came quickly. Noah was at school when the papers were served at Aaron's worksite. I stayed away, as Dana advised, taking my coffee to a quiet diner across town. My phone buzzed just before 10. It was Officer Taylor from the local precinct saying Aaron had caused a scene when the process server arrived, accusing me of being unstable, insisting I had fabricated everything. I agreed to come down and give my statement. At the station, I laid out the binder before Officer Taylor, just as I had with Dana. Page after page of signatures, transfers, photographs, recordings. He listened without interruption, his expression hardening with each detail. "Mrs. Cole, this isn't just grounds for divorce," he said at last. "This is criminal fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. If you're willing, we can press charges against both your husband and your mother." The word mother stuck in my throat, but I forced myself to nod. "Yes," I said. "Press every charge you can." When I returned to the car, I sat for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel. My phone buzzed again, this time with messages from Aaron, some angry, some pleading, all of them manipulative. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove to Noah's school, arriving just as lunch began. I asked his teacher if I could speak with him privately. Sitting together on a bench outside, I told him gently that things were changing, that Dad and Grandma had made choices that meant we would be living differently. His eyes searched mine sharp, with the innocence that often sees more than adults realize. "It's because of Grandma, isn't it?" he asked. I held him close and told him none of it was his fault, that my only promise was to keep him safe. That evening, Noah and I checked into a small hotel across town. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and safety was enough. My phone rang constantly. Aaron Judith numbers I didn't recognize. I silenced it and ordered us pizza instead. Sitting cross-legged on the bed with my son, watching him laugh at a cartoon, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in months. For the first time, the air didn't taste of fear. It tasted of freedom. The call that mattered came just after 6. Officer Taylor's voice was steady as he told me both Aaron and Judith had been taken into custody, charged with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. They would be released on bail, but restraining orders would be issued immediately. "You'll be protected," he said firmly. I thanked him, my hand shaking only slightly as I hung up. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep beside me, I sat in the dim glow of the bedside lamp and let the silence settle. The woman I had been months ago would never have imagined this moment, her husband exposed, her mother arrested, her future, hers alone to decide. I had feared this breaking point for so long, but now that it had come, I realized it was not my world that had shattered. It was theirs. And as I closed my eyes, I knew the next chapter was not about endurance anymore. It was about justice, and justice was already at the door. The morning of the preliminary hearing dawned colder than I expected for late spring. I rose early, smoothing my hair back with hands that shook only slightly. Noah stayed with Evelyn for the day, safe and shielded from the courthouse drama. Driving through the quiet streets, I felt the weight of years pressing down, but beneath it was a current of steadiness. I was no longer the woman who wept in secret behind closed doors. I was the woman who had gathered every piece of truth and was about to place it where it could no longer be denied. The courthouse steps echoed beneath my shoes as I entered the heavy doors, swinging shut with a sound that felt final. Inside, Dana met me with her usual calm presence, handing me a folder, even though I knew its contents by heart. "They'll try to paint you as unstable," she said in a low voice. "But the evidence is overwhelming. Trust the process." I nodded, drawing a long breath before following her into the courtroom. Aaron sat at the defense table in a crisp suit, his jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line. My mother was beside him, pearls at her neck, her expression an icy mask. They didn't look at me when I entered, though I felt their awareness like a heat against my skin. The sight of them together, united not by love, but by their shared betrayal, sent a shiver through me. But I stood taller. This was the day the balance began to shift. Judge Keller presided with a measured authority, his voice steady as he called the room to order. Dana spoke first, laying out the charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. She presented the bank statements, the forged signatures, the recordings of whispered plans. With each document passed to the judge, the foundation of Aaron and Judith's denial cracked further. Carol from the bank testified, her tone professional but firm, confirming that multiple withdrawals had been made without my consent. She identified the forged forms, pointing to details that left no doubt they were falsified. When it was Aaron's turn to speak, he leaned forward, his voice smooth but brittle. He claimed I had grown unstable, that I imagined betrayal where none existed, that he had managed the accounts in good faith. For a moment, his words echoed the same manipulations he had used on me for years, but they no longer had the same power. Dana rose, pressing him with the evidence, and his answers stumbled. His hands clenched, his voice wavered. Across the room, I kept my gaze fixed, unflinching. Judith's testimony was colder. She admitted to lunches and meetings with Aaron, but insisted they were innocent attempts to support her son-in-law through stressful times. Her voice carried a polished tone, one she had used all my life when convincing others she was the steady one. But when Dana played the recording from the night Aaron spoke of emptying the accounts, my mother's laughter filled the courtroom. It was unmistakable. The sound froze the air, leaving no space for her to hide. By the end of the day, the judge ruled that the evidence was sufficient to move forward on all charges. He granted my request for full custody of Noah during proceedings, citing Aaron's instability and risk of financial flight. He froze every shared asset, protecting what remained until the final ruling. As the gavel came down, Aaron's face flushed with fury, and Judith's lips thinned to a sharp line. They had believed I would never fight. Now the fight was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the court, to the law, to justice itself. Outside reporters had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of a fraud case entangling family. Dana shielded me from their questions, steering me down the courthouse steps. "You did well," she murmured. I nodded, my chest tight, with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. For years, I had carried the weight of being less than enough in their eyes. That day, I carried something different, the weight of truth, undeniable and unshakable. In the weeks that followed, the case built momentum. More evidence surfaced. More witnesses came forward. Contractors. Aaron had cheated neighbors who had seen my mother's car parked overnight where it didn't belong. Each piece wove into the pattern I had already known, now visible for all to see. Dana kept me informed, her updates steady, each one another step closer to resolution. Noah adjusted more easily than I had feared. He asked questions, some sharper than I was ready for. But he accepted my answers with a quiet maturity. Evelyn's home became a second refuge for him, filled with books and warmth, and the kind of steadiness I had long wished my own mother could give. Watching him thrive reminded me why I had endured, why I had chosen the harder path instead of silence. The final hearing came in midsummer. This time, the courtroom felt different, the air heavy with expectation. The prosecution laid out their case in full evidence, stacked so high it seemed insurmountable. Aaron sat rigid, his bravado gone. Judith shifted in her seat, eyes darting, her confidence drained. When the judge pronounced their plea agreements, 3 years in prison for Aaron, 18 months for Judith, the sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. It was not triumph I felt then, but release. The burden I had carried for so long lifted, replaced by something quiet and resolute. Afterward, I stood on the courthouse steps, the sunlight bright against my face. Dana clasped my hand. Carol offered a nod from a distance, and Evelyn embraced me when I returned home. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath my feet steady. Their world had collapsed, but mine, fragile as it once seemed, was intact and growing stronger. That night, I tucked Noah into bed and sat beside him until his eyes closed. The house was quiet, but not the suffocating silence I had once endured. This silence was peaceful, the kind that comes when storms have passed. I understood then that justice had been served not just by the law, but by the strength it had taken to reach that moment. And as I turned out the light, I knew one final step remained. It was not about punishment anymore. It was about closure, about claiming the dignity that had always been mine, waiting beneath the weight of betrayal. The weeks after the sentencing brought a quiet I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe without the heaviness of waiting for the next cruel word or careless betrayal. The courthouse doors had closed behind me, and with them, the chapter of my life that had nearly broken me. Noah adjusted faster than I ever imagined. He filled our days with school projects and stories about rockets, and I noticed how his laughter no longer carried that cautious edge. At night, he slept soundly, and so did I. Evelyn's steady presence, her calm wisdom, remained a comfort, reminding me that chosen family could sometimes give more love than blood ever had. I thought often about Aaron and Judith both serving their time. It surprised me that I didn't feel hatred anymore. They had written their own downfall with greed and cruelty, and the law had given them what they earned. What stayed with me wasn't the damage they tried to cause. It was the strength I had discovered in myself by standing against them. Life slowly reshaped itself. I poured energy into the library, expanding community programs, and creating a literacy group for women who had been through hardship. Sitting with them listening to their stories, I realized how many of us had been told we were too weak to fight back. I shared what I could not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who understood. Noah grew taller and more confident with each passing season. One evening after dinner, he looked at me and said, "Mom, you don't seem scared anymore." His words reached into a place I thought would never heal. He was right. Fear no longer lived in my home. In its place was peace, and in that peace, dignity. Looking back, I see now that betrayal, as brutal as it was, gave me a gift. It stripped away illusions and forced me to find the part of myself that no one could steal. The woman I had become was not fragile or invisible. She was whole. And though scars remain, they are reminders that survival is not the end of the story. Thriving is. To anyone listening who has felt small or dismissed, I will tell you what I learned. Strength does not come all at once. It builds in quiet choices, choosing truth over silence, choosing dignity over despair, choosing yourself when no one else does. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.